President Theodore Roosevelt wavered and hesitated before he invited Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner in 1901. It was the first time in American history that a black man would dine as the guest of a sitting president. And Roosevelt hesitated because he was scared. Scared of what his Southern relatives might think, scared of what the newspapers would say the next morning, scared that racist voters would abandon him and that he would lose political support in the South, costing him the next election. Teddy Roosevelt is widely considered to be the most courageous president in American history. He conquered crippling childhood illness through the sheer power of his will. He led the Rough Riders in battle in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. He literally hunted lions on safari in Africa. And yet, despite all of that, he was terrified of what the public would think if he invited a black man to dinner at the White House. And Booker T. Washington was even more afraid than Teddy Roosevelt. If he accepted the invitation, not only would he be risking losing the precarious support of his white Southern donors, but he would literally be risking his life. Booker T. Washington knew that accepting Teddy Roosevelt's invitation to dinner would be kicking a violent hornet's nest. And he was absolutely right about that. As the terrible white supremacist senator from South Carolina, Benjamin Tillman, said in response to that famous dinner, "The actions of President Roosevelt will necessitate our killing 1,000 Negroes before they learn their place again." And yet Booker T. Washington went to that dinner anyway. He went with his head held high, undaunted, and with great pride. As President Roosevelt later wrote, "The very fact that I felt a moment's qualm on inviting him because of the color of his skin made me ashamed of myself. But as things turned out, I'm very glad that I asked him, for the clamor aroused by the dinner makes me feel as if the invitation was absolutely necessary." In other words, Teddy Roosevelt recognized that fear pushed him in the direction of doing the right thing. Because while fear alerts us to danger, it also alerts us to opportunity. If it wasn't scary, everyone would be doing it. And if it were easy, there would be no growth in the process. As Teddy Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor, would later put it, "You must do the things you think you cannot do." The Torah tells us that at the moment of revelation at Sinai, God's presence descended upon the mountain in a great dramatic display of sound and light. Kol ha'am ro'im et hakolot ve'et halapidim ve'et kol ha'shofar. And when the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the blast of the shofar, they trembled with fear. But Moses said to them, "Al tira'u, do not be afraid." And although the commandment, "do not be afraid," is technically not one of the 10 commandments, you can make a reasonable argument that it is, in fact, the 11th commandment. Because al tira'u is the very first commandment that we read following the conclusion of the 10 commandments. And it's a fundamental Jewish idea that we encounter time and again throughout the Hebrew Bible. When God establishes his covenant with Abraham, God tells him not to be afraid. When Jacob goes down to Egypt, God tells him not to be afraid. And in the Torah portion we read just this past Shabbat, Vayelech, as Moses is on the verge of death and the Israelites are about to cross into the promised land without him, he says to them, "Chizku ve'imsu, be strong and courageous, lo tir'ah. Do not be afraid, for God will be with you." The phrase, "do not be afraid," is repeated over 80 times in the Hebrew Bible. And why does the Bible command us so many times not to be afraid? As Rabbi Harold Kushner writes, God commands us not to be afraid, not because there is nothing to fear, but precisely because the world can be such a frightening place. God realizes that we can never fulfill our full potential as human beings if we are paralyzed by fear. The 11th commandment, the commandment not to be afraid, is meant to keep us from missing out on the many blessings of life that are accessible only to those who face their fears. Do not be afraid of being afraid. Our goal should never be the denial of fear, but rather the mastery of fear. One afternoon, a young boy named David was playing outside with his toys, and David took out just about every toy that he owned with him into the backyard, and he was having the absolute time of his life until it started to get dark. And so David came inside, but he left his toys strewn all over the backyard. And when his mother looked out the kitchen window and saw the mess he had left, she called David into the kitchen. "David," she said, "your toys are all over the backyard. Can you go outside and pick them up?" "Well, I'd love to, Mom," David said, "but there's one little problem. I'm afraid of the dark." And his mother smiled at that. "There's no need to be afraid, David," she said. "God is always with you, even in the dark, especially in the dark." "Well, thank you, Mom," David said. "That's very profound. That's very comforting." And so David opened the back door and yelled, "Hey, God, if you're out there, can you pick up my toys?" It's easy to be scared, especially lately. We're all scared. Scared that another variant of this pernicious virus will once again upend our way of life as we know it. Scared that the deep political polarization in this country, the likes of which we have not seen since the Civil War, will continue to sow seeds of division until we tear ourselves apart. Scared about rising inflation rates and the potential long-term ramifications for our economy. And yes, even scared to come to synagogue due to the possibility of yet another mass shooting. There is so much to be scared about these days. But there's an essential distinction between being scared and being afraid. Being scared is temporary. It's a rush of feeling. It's a response to external stimuli. But being afraid, that's something much, much deeper. Being afraid is a fundamental disposition, an existential state of being. Being scared can actually help you. It can make you alert. It can wake you up. It can inform you of danger. But being afraid, that drags you down. That weakens you. That even paralyzes you. As William Faulkner said, be scared. You can't help that. But don't be afraid. Or as Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav very famously put it, Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od, v'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. The entire world is a narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to be afraid. This past summer, Ariel, Amalia, and I were privileged to attend the Newport Folk Festival. And the highlight of the festival for me this year was the surprise Paul Simon performance at the end of the second day. But there was an even bigger surprise at the end of the third day when Joni Mitchell performed on the Newport Folk Festival stage for the first time since 1969. And on top of that, it was Joni's first performance in 23 years. And I'm very sad to say that our 15-month-old daughter, Amalia, was burned out by the end of the day, and we left before Joni Mitchell walked out on stage. But of course, I watched her performance on YouTube after the festival, and if you haven't seen it, it is absolutely phenomenal. Truly one of the most moving and inspiring live performances I've ever seen. Joni Mitchell suffered a near-fatal brain aneurysm in 2015, and in an interview she gave with CBS the morning after her triumphant performance this past summer, she described her experience of the last few years as a return to infancy. She couldn't speak, she couldn't walk, she certainly couldn't play guitar, but she spent the last 7 years relearning what it means to be a musician. She watched hundreds, if not thousands of hours worth of old footage of herself playing guitar so that she could remember where to place her fingers on her own songs. Her neurosurgeon at UCLA had little hope that she would ever play music again, and boy, did Joni prove him wrong. As her surgeon has said, Joni is a miracle. To recover to the point of being able to perform publicly as a musician after an aneurysm like the one she had is nothing short of miraculous. And before she picked up her guitar on the Newport Folk Festival stage, Brandi Carlile, who introduced her that day, said to the crowd, Joni is doing something incredibly brave right now. And Joni performed her classic song, Both Sides Now, at Newport. She was 25 years old when she wrote that song, and when she performed it this past summer, she was approaching 80. And now, finally, Joni Mitchell has genuinely seen life from both sides. But she has also seen life from both sides of her aneurysm. As she might put it, from both win and lose, up and down. And watching her perform on the stage at Newport after her aneurysm was one of the most profound acts of inner strength and willpower and courage that I can possibly imagine. Joni was scared. How could she not have been? But she was not afraid. If you've seen the recent Ken Burns documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, then you learned a great deal about what the United States did not do to prevent the atrocities of the Shoah. It's one of the great moral stains on the soul of our country. But the documentary also tells the stories of people of profound courage, those who stood up and did whatever they could to save as many Jews as they possibly could. In his documentary, one of the stories that Ken Burns tells is the story of Henry Morgenthau, Franklin Roosevelt's Jewish Secretary of the Treasury. On June 19, 1939, over lunch at the White House, Morgenthau attempted something he was loath to do. He prodded his best friend, the President of the United States, to save Jews. "We've gotten nowhere on this Jewish refugee thing," Morgenthau said to FDR. "What are we going to do about the situation of the Jews of Europe?" No other member of the Roosevelt cabinet enjoyed a relationship as intimate with the president as Henry Morgenthau did. The two had a standing lunch date every Monday afternoon, and across Washington, Morgenthau and his wife were known as the couple closest to the Roosevelts. Since the early 20s, they had worked together, socialized together, and really changed the face of the country together. And Morgenthau rarely dared to risk his most treasured friendship, but the story of the St. Louis, the ship carrying nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees that had reached Florida only to be turned back to Europe, haunted Morgenthau. And he knew that he would never be able to live with himself unless he did everything in his power to save the Jews of Europe. As the author Andrew Meyer writes in his new book on Morgenthau, the war in Europe would test him in ways that it would test no other member of the Roosevelt administration. During the early 1940s, Morgenthau would face the greatest test of his career, risking all that he held most dear. Not only his friendship with FDR, but the trust of his colleagues at the Treasury Department and even the safety of his family. And in the end, Morgenthau would rely on his moral compass to affirm his belief in America as a sanctuary for the persecuted. He would spend years pressing his best friend, the President of the United States, to act to save the remaining Jews of Europe before it was too late. Eleanor Roosevelt famously called Henry Morgenthau Franklin's conscience. And despite all of the risks, and there were many, Morgenthau never gave up on pushing Roosevelt to do the right thing. And a year before the end of the war, FDR finally did the right thing. On January 22nd, 1944, President Roosevelt established the War Refugee Board, which was tasked with the immediate rescue of as many of the persecuted minorities of Europe, racial, religious, or political, as possible. For Morgenthau, the establishment of the War Refugee Board was a triumph. In the year before the liberation of Auschwitz in January of 1945, the War Refugee Board helped to save over 200,000 Jews. But for Morgenthau, that was a small victory. Too little, too late. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by the State Department's record of inaction during the peak years of the Holocaust. And yet, despite his failure to get Roosevelt to act sooner, if not for Morgenthau's strength, his persistence, and most of all his courage, those 200,000 Jews would have never made it out of Europe alive. That's the power of courage. Yom Kippur is the culmination of the days of awe, which began all the way back at the beginning of the month of Elul. For 40 days leading up to Yom Kippur and for 10 days following Yom Kippur, we add the 27th Psalm, the Psalm for the high holiday season, to our daily liturgy. Psalm 27 isn't one of the greatest hits of the high holiday season. It's not Avinu Malkeinu, it's not Hineni, it's not Unatana Tokef. It's really much more of a deep cut. And yet we recite it every single day because while it may not be the most famous prayer of this season, it may in fact be the most important prayer of the high holiday season. Psalm 27 begins with the words, LeDavid Adonai Ori V'ishi Mimi Ira. A psalm of David, the Lord is my strength. Of what shall I be afraid? Though an army may besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war may break out against me, even then I will be courageous. The message of the psalm is that the coming year will be filled with hardship and with obstacles and with fear. That's inevitable. But despite that harsh truth, you should not be afraid. Because no matter how scary things get, you will have the strength and the fortitude and the courage to overcome that fear. When the psalmist tells us 3 times in the first 3 verses of Psalm 27 that he is not afraid, the message he conveys is that he in fact is afraid. But he is working so hard to master that fear. And where does he get the strength to master that fear? From God. In the words of Rabbi Harold Kushner, not from a God who protects him from all trouble and danger, but rather from a God who stands with him in times of trouble and danger, so that he never has to feel that he is facing his problems alone. A cancer diagnosis, the loss of a job, the dissolution of a marriage, the death of a loved one. Whenever we feel that something is too overwhelming, too intimidating, too scary, and we say to ourselves, I can't do this, God whispers right back, yes, you can. Chazak ve'ematz, be strong, be courageous, because I am with you. Your family is with you. Your community is with you. You are never alone. As the psalmist teaches us, hope and courage are the will of God. Or as Joni Mitchell might put it, courage helps us to see life from both sides now, from win and lose, from up and down. Amen.
Tears and fears.